Welcome to Career and Leadership Real Talk, the no-nonsense guide for ambitious managers who want to have more impact and progress their career. I'm Pamela Langan, a job search coach and expert CV writer specialising in helping frustrated professionals land the jobs and pay rises they know they deserve.
And I'm Jackie Jagger, a leadership and mindset coach specialising in helping newly promoted and new to role leaders to avoid the dickhead trap and lead with confidence. Between us, we've helped hundreds of leaders and managers to find new roles, take ownership of their careers, and handle the challenges that job searches and leadership responsibility inevitably bring. And now we're joining forces to share with you what we know has worked for our clients. Hello, and welcome to this week's episode. Over the summer, we are going to be bringing you a series around emotional intelligence, which is such an important topic for leaders, and it's something that we haven't done an episode on for absolutely yonks. So over the next 5 weeks, we're going to be bringing you 5 episodes, each focused around a different component element that will help you to really understand the different aspects of emotional intelligence and be able to build and demonstrate them more in your leadership career. So Pam, we're focusing first of all on self-awareness, and this really is the absolute foundation, isn't it, of emotional intelligence?
Yeah, I think it underpins the whole thing, really. And when you're thinking about what that looks like, it's the ability to recognize what you're actually feeling, understand why you're feeling it, and then notice how that emotion is influencing your behavior, the decisions that you make, and how you come across to others. And I think sometimes we don't actually break it down to that level.
Absolutely. When you come to emotional intelligence, those things sound quite simple and quite straightforward, but actually knowing what you're feeling, understanding where it's coming from, and then being able to have that awareness of how that influences how you're operating, how other people might experience you, is actually a really huge topic. It sounds simple, but it's really big, isn't it?
Yeah, I remember when I first discovered emotional intelligence and started looking at what does this mean for me? What does this mean for me in the position that I'm currently working in? And what I started to do is every time I felt something, I was almost analysing that feeling and thinking, what does this mean? Where is it coming from? And in some ways, there's probably times where I definitely overanalyzed some of the interactions and all of that kind of thing. But generally, it was quite a good exercise because what it allowed me to do was figure out which people really triggered me in certain situations and which people brought positivity and which people brought out the best in me. And it was like, okay. And I started to build this picture of how all of these people impacted me. So then when I was going into meetings, when I was having various interactions within my role, that was always then at the front of my mind. It was like, is this a person who will bring out the best in me? Or is this somebody that is going to go head to head with me, trigger me in some way? And depending on what I thought in that situation, then I would go into that interaction, into that meeting with a plan on how I would deal with that. So if it was somebody that would trigger me, for example, because I think that's sometimes the hardest thing to deal with, isn't it? If it was somebody that would trigger me, I'd be like, okay, there's a potential this person will trigger me in some way. So when I feel that, what will I do? How will I respond? How will I react? How will I calm down the situation? How will I calm down my own nervous system in that situation? What will I do? And it really did help me to be better in those interactions and in those meetings. And sometimes I thought, am I overanalyzing all of this stuff? But actually, the more I thought about it, the easier it became. And the quicker I could decide, is this person a trigger? Do they bring the positivity? What's going on? And it was a quick decision, and then it was a quick solution. And it did take a while, but once I had mastered that, it did feel like it made my life so much easier. And also when different feelings were bubbling up to the surface, I was like, okay, this is a new feeling. Where's this coming from? Why did that person trigger that? And I feel like that really helped me throughout my career, just having that self-awareness and being able to home in on those thoughts and feelings and then respond and react appropriately.
I think that's such a great example. And as I'm listening, I'm like, that would have been really useful if I'd have done that in my own career, because I didn't have that same kind of principle or process of analysing and reflecting. And I remember a time where one of my team said to me, I can always tell how your day's going depending on the answer when we used to have like a drink. She was like, if you have a coffee, then it's quite stressed. If you're having a tea, then it's a bit more chill. And if you're having a lemon and ginger tea, it's everything's really going okay. And I just remember her saying that and thinking it was really funny at the time of, oh, but it never occurred to me to do what you did with it and to consider actually, this is really telling me something about how others are experiencing me and how others are interpreting what is going on. So I just thought of that as, I don't know, just like a bit of a funny anecdote, but it could have really helped me to have done more of what you were describing, of really recognizing and understanding. So, what's the problem then when people don't do that? What are some of the things that you see with coaching clients that can happen where people don't understand their own triggers, don't have that kind of process of really gaining that self-awareness?
I think the situation that people find themselves in with that is that they will constantly keep repeating patterns. So they will keep getting triggered by the same types of things and they won't really understand why they're being triggered, but they will keep reacting to those triggers. And what that then results in is that person might come across as quite abrupt, quite difficult to work with, not as approachable and things like that. Whereas as soon as they start recognizing their triggers, all of a sudden it's okay. That's why I'm being defensive. That's why this is happening, or that's why that feels in a certain way. And when they start doing that or thinking about it, it changes. So you can, instead of reacting, you can respond appropriately. And I think that makes all the difference. And I think one of the key things as well around the EQ frameworks is that most of them do build from that self-awareness first, because all of the other factors depend on it. But if you don't get that self-awareness piece right in the first instance, then you can feel like you're emotionally intelligent, but actually, are you really, if you've not mastered that self-awareness element?
Yeah, that's such a great point. And it's interesting because your example was quite different to the example I was thinking in my own head of. So when I think about situations that I'm coaching clients through, I also think there are a lot of times where people don't have the impact that they could have. So maybe not so much that kind of being short or being abrupt or coming across as defensive, but also often shrinking back. So people that maybe don't speak up, don't know how to get their point across, feel maybe intimidated by people. And so I see a lot of times where people, if they don't have that self-awareness of what's causing that, then they can't create their plan for, okay, and how can I still get my message across? How can I handle the way that person makes me feel if I feel like I shrink back when I'm in that person's presence? So then they don't have the impact that they could have because they're holding back because they don't know how else to handle that situation. So I think there's so many ways that, and you're absolutely right, that point of self-awareness being the foundation. And often I think people consider themselves quite emotionally intelligent, but if they don't understand what brings out the best in me, what makes me operate my best, but also what might get in the way of that, what might be some of those emotional triggers that don't allow that to happen, then the other things, the other skills that they have aren't always being used to their fullest.
Yeah, and I think you can't actually regulate emotions that you haven't noticed. So until you start recognizing those emotions, and sometimes you might even need to name those emotions to really understand them. If you don't understand them, you can't regulate them. But as soon as you do understand them and you bring them into your awareness, regulating them actually becomes part of just what you do. And it almost becomes that natural kind of automatic way of dealing with things, doesn't it? Once you bring that into your awareness.
Yeah, I completely agree. Self-regulation is another crucial element, and we're going to focus next week's episode specifically on that. And I think recognizing that you can't regulate what you don't notice is such a crucial element. So, what are the things then that get in the way from people having a real true picture of themselves, their emotions, their triggers? What stops that happening?
So I suppose there's a few things that get in the way. And probably the main two for me are going to be lack of time, because when you're busy, that time to reflect just disappears. It becomes less of a priority. And it can be difficult, can't it, to reflect on things when maybe they've not gone to plan or whatever. So sometimes it's easier, brush things under the carpet and move on. And when we don't prioritize, we don't do it. And then you've got the level of seniority. So the more senior you get, the less honest feedback you receive. So then can you then be stuck in a place where you're thinking everything's going fine because the feedback is fine, but actually how honest is that feedback? And maybe the question is, how are you requesting that? How are you receiving that? And how could you get better feedback?
I think that's such a crucial point because although self-awareness, you can do that reflection piece and you can consider what are my triggers and how do I want to come across and how do I want to operate differently. It's the whole point of it is that impact and how that interacts with others. And so the intent that you have versus the impact of what you do, you can only measure that if you have some means of feedback. And yes, you can try and read and understand that. But I think it's so key that people realize that the more senior you are, the fewer the opportunities for you to get feedback without being intentional about it, because it just is not that common. When you are starting out in your career, in early career, you often get a lot of feedback from above. But when you're in a more senior role, it's not unusual that people in very senior roles don't have consistent one-to-ones, they talk about kind of project stuff, but they often don't get that kind of feedback in that way, and certainly not around kind of behaviors and how they've come across. You get measured much more by those hard metrics, by your KPIs, by your objectives. So yeah, I think that's such a crucial element. So if people are recognizing, okay, I feel like I'm reasonably self-aware, but I'm not sure, and maybe I could do more to build it, where can they make a start? What are some of the simplest approaches that they can take?
Okay, so the most simple thing that people can start with is starting to have some intentional reflection time. So asking yourself after key meetings, how did that land? And being really honest about how it did land, and even thinking about the different people in that meeting and maybe how they received messages or how they reacted or responded. And it could be that you need to have conversations with different people that have been in that meeting to really understand how they felt, how you came across, and things like that. But I think it's just that initial intentional reflection that you can do on your own that is, okay, how do I think that landed?
And I love that because that doesn't mean that people have to schedule half an hour in their diary and journal it out. Just to ask yourself that really simple question and reflect on it in the moment immediately when something has happened can be so powerful in so many ways. So, what else can people do?
So, another thing which is really key, and this is something that I did a lot of in my early career, is using your emotions as signals. So, when they come up, it's acknowledging them, it's feeling them. Sometimes you can label them, but the key part of it is when that emotion bubbles up, it's considering where is it coming from? Why am I feeling this way? What is happening for me? And really thinking about how that is making you feel. Now, there'll be loads of different emotions that you feel, and sometimes those emotions can be they can be a little bit sad, I can feel a little bit upset. I think it's more of the negative ones that affect you more than the positive ones. But I always like to, even now in my kinds of everyday life interactions or the business stuff that we do together, I'm always, if an emotion comes up to the surface, I am asking myself, what does this mean? Where is it coming from? Because then I can decide, is this something I need to work on? Is this a development point for me? Because I think we're always developing and there's always something that's going to come in left field. Always, isn't there? It's just good to be constantly recognizing and reviewing those emotions.
And I would really encourage people to label and to notice and to label the positive emotions as well. Because I think a lot of times self-awareness, the assumption is that people need to be more self-aware because they need to develop things that are not working as well for them. But in reality, a huge part of developing is really getting clarity on what are your strengths, what are the things that work for you, what are the things that come naturally to you, what are the things that are easy for you, and leveraging those rather than trying to fix these other things. So I think it's actually just as important to notice and to label some of those positive emotions and to recognize, why was that? Why did that? If the answer to the first question was that landed really well in the meeting, why was that? What was it about how I delivered it? What was it about the way that I operated? What was the reason? And you're allowed to feel pride and to feel successful and to feel happy and relaxed. So noticing those other emotions rather than just labeling the negative ones, I think is a real benefit for understanding where are my strengths, where are the things that come naturally to me, and then asking the question of how can I use those more to operate at my best more of the time. Any final points then in terms of people that want to build greater self-awareness?
So I think another thing that people can do is request specific feedback about their impact. So you can ask people like, what's something that I do that I might not notice? And I think that's really powerful. And in the past, when I've asked that question, I found that, and I didn't even realize I was doing this, that in meetings, when I was trying to get my point across, I would do this little giggle. And people had noticed that I would do this little giggle. And a couple of people said to me, I've noticed when you're trying to get a really strong point across, then you'll end it on a giggle and it lessens the impact of that message. So I was like, oh my goodness, I did not know I was doing that. So then I became more aware that I was doing it. And what I realized is that it was almost like a little bit of a defense mechanism, because it was like, I'm getting this really great point across, but at the same time, maybe I'm doubting myself a little bit. So then I'd do this like little to finish it off. And it was, I suppose, I was just letting people know that this is my thought. You can disagree with it. We're going to keep it quite jovial. And it was lessening the impact. As soon as I had that feedback from a couple of people, I thought, wow, that's so interesting. And I didn't know I was doing it. I stopped doing it and found that my messages and the things that I needed to get across started landing a lot more effectively. And people started treating me slightly differently and like acknowledging that senior level that I was at. And I thought, wow, if I had never asked that question, I would never have known. I would have carried on giggling. I wouldn't have even known that I was doing it. But it was obviously a defense mechanism of some sort. But it was easy enough to resolve. So I think that's another key one for me.
Yeah, I love that. I think it's a great example of we judge ourselves by the intention that we have. So we tend to notice or assume that the intent that we have is what's actually landing. And yeah, what a great question, because small thing, but really huge impact. And So I think that one's really valuable for people to, because I suspect there'll be a lot of times where people have got some of those small habits or small things that people wouldn't think to make a point of commenting on. And so when you ask that question and you open up that door to say, what's something that I do that maybe I don't realize that I do, that might, and I think you can then add that might be lessening my impact. And I think that can, yeah, be incredibly powerful. Thank you so much for joining us. As we said, this will be the first of 5 episodes over the summer, focusing on different elements of emotional intelligence. So if you're listening to this and have any questions around it or anything you want us to incorporate, then please do let us know. And let us know whether you use those tactics or suggestions to improve your own self-awareness. Thanks for listening, and we'll be back next week with another episode. Exciting news from us. If you're an ambitious leader or manager earning 50k or more and you're ready to take your career to the next level, we have an opportunity for you. Introducing Catalyst Career Club, your secret weapon for unlocking career success. As a member, you'll get access to monthly live training sessions, exclusive job opportunities, and the ability to get personalised advice from us on your toughest career challenges.
We've helped thousands of driven leaders like you secure significant pay rises, land dream roles, and thrive in their careers. And now we want to support you in achieving your most ambitious career goals too. Membership is just $6.99 per month with no contract or tie-in. And as a special bonus for being our podcast listeners, you can use the code podcast at checkout to get your first month for just £1. Head over to pamelalangan.com/Catalyst Career Club to sign up now, and we'll see you inside.